The air inside the Liberty Creek John Deere dealership in the spring of '68 hung thick with the smell of new paint, green and yellow, and the clean, almost sweet scent of fresh rubber. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. Silas Blackwood, however, smelled only of diesel and dirt, a scent that clung to his worn denim jacket like a second skin. He stood at the parts counter, a busted magneto coil held gently in his calloused palm. It was off his old John Deere Model G, the one his father had bought brand new right after the war. The tractor was slow, loud, and stubborn, but it was his. More importantly, it was paid for. "Gonna be a few days, Silas," said Carl Jennings from behind the counter, not even looking up from his ledger. "Have to order that one in from Moline. Nobody runs those old two-lungers anymore." "I do," Silas said, his voice low and even. He didn't take offense. It was just a fact. A loud laugh erupted from the showroom floor. "Still trying to keep that museum piece running, Blackwood?" Silas turned. Dale Peterson was leaning against the enormous rear tire of a brand-new John Deere 4020, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Dale was everything Silas was not. His boots were new, his jeans were creased, and his face was tanned from leisure, not labor. He'd inherited the farm next to Silas's 5 years ago, and had immediately mortgaged it to the hilt, buying the newest and biggest of everything. "It gets the work done, Dale," Silas replied, turning back to the counter. "Work?" Dale scoffed, walking over. He flicked his cigarette ash onto the pristine dealership floor. "My new 4020 here will plow in a day what takes you a week with that pop nonsense. 100 horsepower, Blackwood. Synchro range transmission. Power steering. It's the future. You're living in the past." Carl Jennings finally looked up, a sycophantic smile plastered on his face as he looked at Dale. "Just finishing up the paperwork on this beauty for Mr. Peterson here. Second new tractor he's bought in 3 years. Dale beamed, puffing out his chest. "You gotta spend money to make money, Carl. You tell him." Silas ignored them both. He placed the greasy magneto coil on a piece of newspaper he'd brought to protect the counter. "Just let me know when it comes in, Carl." As he turned to leave, a thought, foolish and fleeting, crossed his mind. He paused and looked at the gleaming 4020, the clean lines, the comfortable-looking seat, the sheer power it represented. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like. No more wrestling a stiff steering wheel, no more standing on one brake to make a tight turn. Just smooth, quiet power. "Thinking of an upgrade, Silas?" Carl asked, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Silas hesitated, just wondering what something like that runs. Dale let out another booming laugh. "More than you've got in your whole operation, Blackwood. This ain't no $500 Farmall M you're looking at." Carl leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, though it was loud enough for Dale to hear and chuckle. "Look, Silas, with all due respect, your kind of operation, running that old equipment, just farming your daddy's original quarter section, it just doesn't qualify for the kind of credit we're extending to these days. We need to see growth, expansion. You understand, it's a numbers game." The words hit Silas harder than a physical blow. Too poor for credit. He, a man who hadn't owed a dime to anyone since he'd paid off his father's funeral expenses 10 years prior. He, whose land was free and clear. He was being told he wasn't good enough to even borrow money, standing in the same spot where his father had paid cash for a new tractor 20 years ago. The smell of new paint suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. He looked from Carl's pitying face to Dale's mocking one. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, turned his back on the new 4020, and walked out the door into the bright, clean air of the spring afternoon. The shame burned hot on the back of his neck. He could feel their eyes on him, dismissing him as a relic, a failure, a man left behind by the march of progress. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks watching, have you ever been in a situation like that? Have you ever been looked down on, maybe even laughed at, for being careful with your money, for running old iron because it was paid for, while everyone else was chasing the newest, shiniest thing on credit? Drop a comment below and let me know, because Silas Blackwood carried the sting of that moment with him as he drove his old Ford pickup down the gravel road back to the farm. It was a sting that wouldn't fade for a long, long time. The farm looked the same as it always had. The barn, painted red by his grandfather, was faded to a soft, dusky rose. The house was small but solid, the porch swing his father built still hanging from the rafters. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't a showplace like Dale Peterson's, with his new metal pole barns and freshly painted white fences. But every board, every nail, every acre of it was his. That thought was the only thing that cooled the burn of humiliation. He parked the truck next to his workshop, a converted chicken coop that smelled of penetrating oil, hot steel, and 60 years of hard work. Inside, it was a cathedral of self-reliance. Tools hung in their proper places on the walls, outlines drawn in black paint, so you knew exactly where the 9/16" combination wrench belonged. Coffee cans filled with sorted nuts, bolts, and washers lined the shelves. In the center of the concrete floor sat the John Deere G, its green paint scarred and faded, its hood removed, exposing the big, simple, two-cylinder engine. He didn't need Carl Jennings's part from Moline. Not really. He just hoped for the easy way out for once. Now, pride wouldn't allow it. He set the burnt-out coil on his workbench, a heavy slab of oak scarred with the marks of countless projects. He switched on the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the room filled with a warm yellow light. For the next 2 hours, Silas was lost to the world. He worked with a surgeon's precision, his big, rough hands surprisingly nimble. He carefully unwound the fine copper wire from the old coil, counting the wraps. He didn't have a new bobbin, so he'd have to rewind this one. He had a spool of shellac-coated magnet wire he'd salvaged from an old generator years ago, tucked away for just such an occasion. Patience was a tool, just like a screwdriver or a wrench. His father had taught him that. A man who can't wait for the right moment, his father used to say, is a man who will always be paying someone else for their time. He clamped the bobbin in his bench vise, padded with leather to prevent marring it. Then, with a slow, steady hand, he began to wind the new copper wire. Round and round, layer upon layer, each one tighter and more perfect than the last. The world outside the small window of the workshop faded away. There was no Dale Peterson, no smirking dealer, no shame. There was only the task at hand, the feel of the wire between his thumb and forefinger, the satisfying tension, the slow transformation of a useless part into a functional one. This was his kingdom. Here he wasn't too poor for credit. Here he was capable. He was independent. After what felt like an eternity, the coil was wound. He painted it with a thin coat of insulating varnish, the sharp, chemical smell filling the small space. While it dried under the heat of a lamp, he turned his attention to the magneto's points. He filed them flat and clean with a fine ignition file, then set the gap with a feeler gauge, the thin strip of metal sliding in with just the slightest drag. It was a delicate dance, a matter of a few thousandths of an inch that meant the difference between a hot blue spark and a weak yellow flicker. By the time dusk settled over the fields, casting long shadows from the oak trees, the varnish was dry. He reassembled the magneto, the pieces fitting together with a familiar, satisfying click. He carried it out to the waiting tractor and bolted it back into place. He connected the plug wires, then climbed onto the iron seat that had been worn smooth by his father's body and his own. He opened the petcocks on top of the cylinders, turned the big flywheel over by hand a few times to prime it, then closed them. He set the throttle, retarded the spark, and stood on the flywheel. He gave it a mighty heave, throwing his whole body into it. The engine coughed once, a puff of white smoke from the exhaust stack. He pulled again, harder this time. The engine spun, caught, and then erupted into its iconic, rhythmic beat. Pop, 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 pop. It wasn't the smooth roar of Dale's new 4020. It was the sound of a heartbeat, slow, steady, and reliable. Silas let the engine warm up, the sound echoing across the quiet farmstead. He looked out over the fields he had to plough, the 160 acres that had sustained his family for 3 generations. It wasn't much compared to the empire Dale Peterson was building on the bank's money. But tonight, with the thrum of his resurrected tractor vibrating through the soles of his boots, it felt like enough. It had to be. The story of Silas's humiliation at the dealership spread through Liberty Creek like wildfire on a dry prairie. Dale Peterson made sure of it. At the co-op, at the diner, over the party line telephone, Dale painted the picture of Silas as a pitiable throwback, a man too stubborn and too broke to join the modern world. "Saw old Silas in at the deer dealer," he'd say, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, a crowd of other farmers listening in. Staring at my new 4020, like a kid with his nose pressed against a candy store window. Carl had to tell him straight, he just doesn't have the collateral for a modern machine. The other farmers, most of them up to their eyeballs in debt themselves for new equipment, would nod sagely. It was the era of "get big or get out," a mantra pushed by the universities and the government. To them, Silas's debt-free status wasn't a sign of wisdom, it was a sign of stagnation. His old Farmall M, which he used for planting and cultivating, and his John Deere G for ploughing, were objects of ridicule. "Heard he spent a whole day rewinding a magneto coil," one would chuckle. "My boy could have driven to the city and back twice to buy a new one in that time." "Time is money," another would add, parroting the popular phrase. Silas heard the whispers. He felt the stares when he went to town. He saw the way other men would stop talking when he approached. It was a lonely existence. He worked from sunup to sundown, his only companions the steady rhythm of his old tractors and the radio in the barn he listened to late at night. The work was harder, no doubt. While Dale sat in the enclosed cab of his 4020, listening to the radio with the air conditioner blowing, Silas was out in the elements. He ate dust all day long behind the G, his face a grimy mask by lunchtime. When a sudden spring shower blew in, Dale was dry and comfortable. Silas was soaked to the bone, the cold rain running down his back. One afternoon, in the middle of planting season, the final drive on his Farmall M started to howl. It was a sound every farmer dreads, the sound of grinding metal deep in the guts of the machine. He limped it back to the workshop, the noise getting louder with every revolution of the tires. Dale Peterson, cultivating the field that bordered Silas's land, saw him. He stopped his new International Harvester 1066 at the fence line, the big diesel engine rumbling with contempt. He just sat there, watching, a smug look on his face. He didn't offer to help. He just watched Silas, a man defeated by his own stubbornness. Silas didn't look at him. He just focused on getting the M into the shop. The repair would take 2 days. He had to drain the heavy gear oil, support the tractor on blocks, pull the massive rear wheel, and then unbolt the entire final drive housing. It was heavy, greasy, back-breaking work. He found the problem: A main bearing had disintegrated, sending shrapnel through the other gears. He spent hours cleaning every piece, meticulously picking out bits of metal with a magnet and a rag. He had a spare bearing on the shelf, salvaged from a junked tractor years ago, and the gears, thankfully, were only nicked, not destroyed. He stoned the burrs off them, washed everything in solvent, and began the slow, arduous process of reassembly. Those were 2 days of planting he lost. 2 days where Dale's 1066 ran up and down the rows, never stopping. The whole county saw Silas's planter sitting idle in the half-finished field. It was another mark against him, another piece of evidence for the case that he was failing. But when he finally finished the repair, torqued the last bolt, and filled the housing with fresh oil, the old farmel ran quieter than it had in years. He had saved himself a repair bill that would have run into the hundreds of dollars, and he knew, intimately, the condition of every gear and bearing in that final drive. Dale, if his IH ever broke down, would just call the dealer and write a check. He wouldn't have the first clue what was wrong with it. Silas wondered which man was truly the poorer. The years began to tick by. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s. And then something shifted. The world changed. President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Grain exports to the Soviet Union exploded. Suddenly, the price of corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, shot up to $2, then $3. Land values, which had been flat for a generation, doubled and then doubled again. A wave of unbelievable prosperity washed over the American heartland. It was the boom time. For men like Dale Peterson, it was a golden age. He was perfectly positioned, leveraged to the hilt. The soaring price of his crops and the skyrocketing value of his land meant the banks couldn't give him money fast enough. He was a genius, a visionary. He bought the 80 acres to the south of him, then the quarter section to the west, when old man Hemlock retired. He traded in the 40-20 and the 1066 for a fleet of brand-new John Deeres, a 4430 and a mighty 4630, both with the revolutionary Sound Guard cab. They looked like spaceships next to Silas's old iron. He bought a new Gleaner L2 combine, a silver behemoth that could swallow 8 rows of corn at a time. His farm grew to over 1,000 acres. He built a new house on a hill overlooking his land, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 2-car garage. He drove a new Lincoln Continental to church on Sundays. The talk at the diner was all about Dale's success. He was the man. He was the future of farming in Liberty Creek. And Silas? Silas just kept doing what he had always done. The boom was good to him, too. The money pouring in from $3 corn was unlike anything he'd ever seen. But he didn't act like it. He didn't change a thing. His neighbors saw the profits he had to be making and watched, waiting for him to finally break down and buy a new tractor, to buy more land, to join the party. He did none of it. Instead, the first thing he did was take a cashier's check to the bank and pay off the last of the small mortgage his father had taken out 25 years before. The bank teller, a young woman who was used to processing loan applications, not final payments, looked at him with confusion, but the bank president came out of his office to shake Silas's hand. "Congratulations, Silas," he'd said. "You're a rare breed these days. A man who owns his land outright." With the rest of the money, Silas was methodical. He bought the best hybrid seed available. He paid for soil testing and applied fertilizer and lime with scientific precision. He replaced the old wooden corn crib with a modern steel grain bin, paying the contractor in cash. It allowed him to store his grain and wait for the best prices instead of being forced to sell at harvest time when the market was flooded. He bought one new piece of equipment, a used John Deere S700 combine from the late 60s. It was a good, solid machine, but already 10 years old and a fraction of the cost of Dale's new L2. He paid cash for it. He kept his old Ford pickup. He kept living in the small farmhouse. He kept his money in savings bonds and certificates of deposit at the bank. To everyone else, it looked like madness. He was a miser, a fool sitting on a pile of cash while the opportunity of a lifetime was passing him by. He could have been a king like Dale Peterson. Instead, he was just old Silas. One crisp autumn afternoon, both men found themselves waiting in line to unload corn at the grain elevator. Dale pulled up alongside Silas's old truck in his shiny new Ford F-250. He rolled down the electric window. "Still driving this old thing, Silas?" Dale asked, not unkindly, but with the weary pity one might show a stubborn child. "You could afford a new one, you know. You could afford a whole lot of things." "She gets me where I need to go," Silas said, looking straight ahead at the weighing platform. "Look," Dale said, leaning his arm on the windowsill. "I know we've had our differences, but I'm telling you, man to man, you're missing the boat. Land's never going to be this cheap again. The bank will give you whatever you want. You could double your acreage, triple it. We're in a new era. The old rules don't apply anymore." "The old rules always apply, Dale," Silas said quietly. "Sooner or later." Dale just shook his head and laughed, a mix of frustration and amusement. "Suit yourself, Blackwood. Stay small. Stay poor. Some people just don't know how to win." He rolled up his window. The electric motors were a stark contrast to the creak of Silas's hand crank. As Silas drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, he felt a familiar loneliness creep in. Was Dale right? Was he a fool? He saw the lights of Dale's big new house blazing on the hilltop, a monument to success. He saw his own small, dark house waiting for him at the end of the lane. For a moment, doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his resolve. He had more money in the bank than he had ever dreamed of, yet he was living like a pauper. He was the laughing stock of the county, a man defined by what he didn't have. He pulled into his yard and cut the engine. He sat there in the silence, the ticking of the cooling metal the only sound. He switched on the radio. The farm report was over, replaced by the national news. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking. He was talking about inflation, about oil prices, about a man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was talking about the prime interest rate and how it had just climbed to a shocking 12%. Most farmers would have switched it off, uninterested in the dry talk of economics from Washington. But Silas listened. He listened to every word. A knot began to tighten in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that the rules hadn't changed at all. The party was almost over. And when the music stopped, there were going to be a lot of men like Dale Peterson left standing without a chair. He looked out across his own dark, quiet fields, paid for and clear, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel poor. He felt safe. A storm was coming, and he had built his house on a rock. The first sign of the coming storm was not a thundercloud, but a number on a television screen. By the fall of 1979, the prime interest rate, a term most farmers had never paid much attention to, was a daily topic of conversation at the Liberty Creek Diner. It had climbed into the double digits, a place it had never been in their lifetimes. Dale Peterson, holding court from his usual booth, dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "It's temporary," he'd announced, stirring his coffee. "A little belt tightening from Washington. It'll come back down by spring planting. You've got to have faith in the system. The other farmers, most of them leveraged just like Dale, nodded in agreement. They had to believe he was right. Their survival depended on it. Silas, sitting alone at the counter, just paid for his pie and left. He didn't need to hear it. He could feel the change in the air, as surely as he could feel a shift in the wind before a rain. The easy credit that had fueled the boom was evaporating. The music was fading. That winter, the chill was more than just in the air. The price of diesel fuel nearly doubled. The cost of fertilizer went up by 30%. These were body blows to a farmer's bottom line. For Silas, they were painful, but manageable. He bought his fuel in the fall, before the last price hike, and his careful soil management meant he used less fertilizer than most. For Dale Peterson, with over 1,000 acres to plant and a fleet of thirsty, high-horsepower tractors to feed, the rising costs were catastrophic. He was borrowing money just to put a crop in the ground, and the interest rate on his operating loan was now a staggering 18%. The true turning point came in the middle of a wet May. Dale was trying to beat the rain, running his big John Deere 4630 day and night to get his corn planted. The tractor was only a few years old, the pride of his fleet, with its comfortable Soundguard cab and a complex hydraulic system that ran everything from the power steering to the three-point hitch. One afternoon, Silas was mending a fence along their property line when he saw the 4630 grind to a halt in the middle of the field. He watched as Dale climbed out, kicked one of the massive rear tires in frustration, and slammed the cab door. Silas saw the service truck from the John Deere dealership arrive a few hours later. He watched two mechanics in clean coveralls swarm over the machine, scratching their heads. They worked until dusk and then left, the big tractor sitting silent and dead in the muddy field. The next day, they were back with more equipment. Silas learned the story later at the co-op. A hydraulic pump had failed, sending metal shavings throughout the entire closed center system. It was a nightmare scenario in a modern tractor. Every hydraulic line had to be flushed, the filters replaced, the valves cleaned, and the main pump, a piece of precision engineering the size of a suitcase, had to be replaced. The part wasn't in stock. It had to be flown in from the regional warehouse in Des Moines. The tractor sat idle for 4 days. 4 crucial planting days. Lost. The final repair bill, Silas heard, was over $5,000. It was more than Silas had paid for his entire collection of tractors combined. The incident exposed the hidden fragility of Dale's high-tech empire. His machines were powerful and efficient, but they were also complicated and impossibly expensive to fix. He was completely dependent on the dealership, on their specialized tools and their access to parts. When they broke, he could do nothing but stand by and write a check. The cracks in Dale's facade began to show. The easy confidence was replaced by a tense, worried energy. He was on the phone constantly, arguing with the bank, pleading with suppliers. The price of corn, instead of rebounding, began to slide downwards. The perfect storm was gathering force, soaring input costs, crushing interest rates, and falling commodity prices. Dale was caught in the middle, exposed on all sides. One evening, Silas was in his workshop, grinding the valves on the engine of his Farmall M. It was a slow, meticulous job he did every few years. He heard a truck pull into his lane and looked up to see Dale's F-250. Dale got out and walked slowly towards the open workshop door, stopping at the threshold. He looked tired, his face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there a year ago. "Blackwood," he said, his voice quiet. He looked at the disassembled engine on Silas's workbench. "Still tinkering with that old junk." It wasn't an insult this time. It sounded almost wistful. "Keeps me out of trouble," Silas replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Dale hesitated, looking out at Silas's neat farmstead. "That grain bin?" he said, nodding towards the steel cylinder. "You paid cash for that, didn't you?" "I did," Silas said. "And you haven't sold last year's corn yet." It wasn't a question. "Still in there," Silas confirmed. Dale ran a hand through his hair. "The bank is calling my note. They want a payment I can't make. I've got to sell, but the price is in the gutter. If I could just hold on for a few more months—" His voice trailed off. He was asking for a loan, Silas realized. Not directly, but he was asking. He was hoping Silas, the man he'd mocked for years, the man he'd called poor, would bail him out. Silas thought for a long moment. He thought of the shame he'd felt in the dealership. He thought of the whispers and the laughter. He could have savored this moment, turned Dale away, and watched his empire crumble. But looking at the desperation in the other man's eyes, he felt no triumph. He only felt a deep, weary sadness for what was happening to his community. "I can't lend you money, Dale," Silas said finally, his voice even. "It wouldn't be right. It wouldn't even be enough to fix your problems. It would just be a patch on a bursting dam." Dale's shoulders slumped. He nodded, a flicker of his old pride returning. "Right. Figured as much. Shouldn't have asked." He turned to leave. "But I'll tell you what I will do," Silas said, stopping him. "My G is all tuned up. I've got a full tank of fuel. My fields are done. If you need another tractor in the field to get your planting finished, I'll be over at sunup. No charge." Dale stood frozen for a moment, his back to Silas. He didn't turn around. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, got in his truck, and drove away. The next morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, Silas drove his old John Deere G across the fence line and began turning over the soil in Dale Peterson's field, its steady pop, 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 a lonely, defiant rhythm against the encroaching silence of the crisis. By 1982, the crisis was no longer a storm on the horizon. It was a full-blown deluge. The Federal Reserve, in its brutal war against inflation, had pushed the prime rate to an unthinkable 21%. Land values, which had been the foundation of the farm economy's paper wealth, collapsed by more than half. Farmers who had borrowed against their equity suddenly owed more on their land than it was worth. The word foreclosure, which had been a ghost story from the Great Depression, became a grim reality. Farm auctions became a weekly spectacle of sorrow. Neighbors stood in silence, hats in their hands, as the life's work of a family was sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder. The auctioneer's fast-paced chant was a funeral dirge for a way of life. Dale Peterson's auction was on a cold, blustery day in November. The sky was the color of lead. The entire county was there, it seemed, not to gloat, but to bear witness. The Lincoln Continental was the first to go, sold for a fraction of what Dale had paid. Then came the household goods, the tools from his shop, and finally, the machinery. The gleaming fleet of John Deeres and the Silver Gleaner combine looked absurdly magnificent, like monuments to a fallen king. They were sold one by one, the prices heartbreakingly low. There was no money in the county to pay what they were worth. Silas was there. He didn't bid. He just stood at the back of the crowd, his collar turned up against the wind. He saw Dale standing near the empty house, his wife beside him, both of them looking like ghosts. He saw Carl Jennings from the John Deere dealership, his face pale and drawn. The dealership's own survival was tied to the fortunes of men like Dale. Carl had extended millions in credit, guaranteed by the manufacturer, but with so many farmers defaulting, the whole system was collapsing. Silas drove home in a somber quiet. His own farm was an island of tranquility. Because he had no debt, the 21% interest rate was just a number on the news. Because his production costs were low, he could still break even on $2 corn. Because he had his own grain storage, he could wait out the lowest prices. The principles his father had taught him, patience, self-reliance, and an aversion to debt, had been derided as old-fashioned and foolish during the boom. Now, they were the very things that ensured his survival. His old simple machines were his salvation. When the magneto on the G acted up again, he didn't have to call a dealer. He just took it into his shop and fixed it in an afternoon. When a bearing went out on his old 7700 combine, he pressed in a new one himself for $20. He was in control of his own destiny. The downfall of Dale Peterson was swift and complete. He lost the land, the house, everything. They moved into a small rental house in town, and Dale, the man who had once commanded a 1,000-acre empire, took a job sweeping floors and stocking shelves at the local hardware store. The change was shocking. He seemed to have shrunk, the swagger gone, replaced by a permanent stoop in his shoulders. The John Deere dealership in Liberty Creek held on for another year. But it was no use. With no one buying new equipment and dozens of farmers defaulting on their loans, the bank finally pulled the plug. Carl Jennings, who had once smugly told Silas he wasn't qualified for credit, lost his business, his savings, and his reputation. The big glass windows of the showroom were papered over, and a bank-owned sign was posted on the door. The smell of new paint and fresh rubber was replaced by the stale scent of failure. The future that Dale and Carl had championed, a future built on credit and ever bigger machines, had crashed and burned. Silas just kept on working. He saw other neighbors struggling, men who were good farmers but had been caught in the credit trap. He started helping them. He'd use his old G to plow a field for a neighbor whose tractor was repossessed, asking only for a share of the crop in return. He'd spend an evening in his workshop, helping another man rebuild a transmission, refusing any payment. The community's perception of him began to change. He was no longer old Silas, the eccentric miser. He was Silas Blackwood, the man who had seen the storm coming, the man who had survived. He was the man you went to when you needed help, not with money, but with the practical knowledge of how to keep old iron running, how to make do, how to endure. He had become the bedrock of a community that was crumbling around him. The spring of 1988 was a season of cautious rebirth. The worst of the farm crisis had passed. Interest rates were back in the single digits, and land prices had stabilized, though at a level far below their peak. The landscape was scarred. For sale signs still dotted the county roads, and many farmhouses stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes. But for those who had survived, there was a sense of weary hope. One morning, Silas saw a notice in the local paper. The bank was finally auctioning off the assets of the defunct Liberty Creek John Deere dealership. The building, the tools, the parts inventory, and all remaining equipment were to be sold in one lot. A flicker of an idea that had been slowly forming in the back of his mind for years, solidified into a plan. On the day of the auction, Silas drove his old Ford pickup to town and parked a block away. He walked to the dealership, the same place where he had been humiliated 20 years earlier. The big showroom was dusty and filled with an echoing silence. A small crowd had gathered, bankers in suits, scrap metal dealers, a few curious farmers. He saw Carl Jennings standing off to one side, looking thin and aged, a spectator at the dismantling of his own life. The auctioneer, a man from the city, began his spiel. He talked about the building, the prime location, the value of the parts inventory. Then he gestated towards the back lot. And included in this sale, he announced, are 8 brand new, never sold John Deere tractors, models from 82 and 83, a 4850, two 4450s, and 5 smaller utility tractors, all sold as one lot. These were the machines that had arrived just as the crisis hit, the last shining symbols of the boom, now obsolete and sun-faded after sitting for 5 years. The bidding started low. A developer offered a price for the value of the land. A parts dealer offered a bit more for the inventory. The numbers crept up slowly. Nobody seemed to want the whole package, especially the tractors. They were white elephants, too big, too complex, and too expensive for the battered local economy. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer tried to coax a higher number, his voice growing desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." In the quiet that followed, Silas's voice, calm and clear, cut through the room. $500,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads swiveled to find the source of the incredible bid. They saw Silas Blackwood, standing near the back, his hands in the pockets of his denim jacket. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. "Sir, I need to know if you are a qualified bidder for that amount." Silas didn't flinch. He walked forward, past the stunned faces of his neighbors, past Carl Jennings, whose eyes were wide with disbelief. He reached the auctioneer's podium and laid a piece of paper on it. It was a cashier's check from the Liberty Creek Savings Bank, made out for the full amount. "I believe you'll find that's in order," Silas said quietly. The auctioneer stared at the check, then at Silas, and then back at the check. "Sold!" he finally stammered, banging his gavel with a loud crack that echoed through the silent showroom. "To the man in the denim jacket." The news was all over the county by noon. Silas Blackwood, the man they called too poor for credit, had bought the John Deere dealership's entire assets, with cash. No one could understand it. But Silas had no intention of being a dealer. He sold the building to the local co-op for what he'd paid for it. He sold the parts and tools to a young mechanic who was starting his own repair shop. His prize was the 8 tractors. He had them hauled back to his farm, where he lined them up in the pasture. He didn't gloat. He didn't show them off. He began a new kind of work. He started a small-scale leasing program. He offered the new, reliable tractors to young farmers, men who had survived the crisis but couldn't get a bank loan to upgrade their worn-out equipment. He didn't charge interest. He charged a fair share of the crop, the same kind of deal he'd made with his neighbors during the worst of times. He was providing a path forward. A few weeks later, Silas drove into town and went to the hardware store. He found Dale Peterson at the back, stacking bags of concrete, his movements slow and tired. "Dale," Silas said. Dale looked up, startled. He wiped a dusty hand on his pants. "Silas, heard what you did. Can't say I understand it." "I bought your old place at the sheriff's sale last year," Silas said, getting straight to the point. "The bank was going to sell it to some out-of-state investment company. Didn't seem right." Dale's face hardened. "Come to rub it in? To show me the big man you are now?" "No," Silas said, his voice gentle. "I came to offer you a job. The place needs a manager. Someone who knows that land better than anyone. Someone who knows how to farm it right. I'll pay you a salary. The old farmhouse is empty. You and your wife can live there. It's not ownership, I know, but it's a way back to the land." Dale stared at him, his eyes filled with a storm of conflicting emotions, shame, anger, pride, and a flicker of something else, hope. He looked down at his calloused, dirty hands. He looked at the rows of shovels and rakes. Then he looked back at Silas. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "Why?" Dale whispered. "After everything, why would you do this for me?" "Because this community needs good farmers, Dale," Silas said, And you are a good farmer. You just flew too close to the sun. It's time to come back to Earth." Years later, Silas was an old man. His hair was white, and his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were still clear. He sat on his porch swing, the same one his father had built, watching his grandson, a young man of 16, driving the old John Deere G across the hayfield. Dale Peterson, now a trusted friend and partner, was running the combined operation, farming both places with a quiet competence, his past mistakes a source of wisdom, not shame. The community had healed. The lessons of the crisis had been hard won, but they had sunk in. People talked less about getting big and more about being sustainable. They talked about Silas Blackwood with a kind of reverence, telling the story of the man who was right all along, not because he was smarter, but because he was wiser. The grandson finished his work and drove the old tractor up the lane. He cut the engine, and the familiar pop, pop, pop gave way to a peaceful silence, punctuated by the chirping of crickets. He came and sat on the porch steps next to his grandfather. "Grandpa," he said, "why do we still keep this old thing running? We've got those newer tractors you bought. They're faster and more comfortable." Silas looked at the boy, and then out at the land, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "That tractor," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is a reminder. It reminds us that the best things aren't always the newest or the most expensive. It reminds us that a man's real worth isn't in what he owes, but in what he owns. It's not about the horsepower under the hood. It's about the skill in your hands and the wisdom in your heart. That sound it makes. That's not just an engine. That's the heartbeat of this farm. Slow, steady, and paid for. Never forget that." The boy nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked at the old green tractor with a newfound respect. And Silas Blackwood, the farmer they once called too poor for credit, leaned back in his swing, content, listening to the quiet rhythm of the land he had saved by never trying to conquer it.